Good evening and welcome to The Conversation, where we will elaborate on the economic challenges and social shifts to political dynamics and cultural resilience. Tonight's program features thought leader and expert Dr. Diana Thorburn, who is the director of the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI. I'm your host, Kwame Thomas. Let's begin. Welcome to The Conversation. Dr. Thorburn, welcome. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
So we have heard, I've looked at some of your work, your institution's work, and I recognize that you have highlighted in some of the research systemic challenges underlying both violence and labor market disengagement in Jamaica. And so the first question is, why is a shift from traditional interventions such as skills training for at-risk youth and/or behavior change programs necessary to address these deep-rooted issues effectively?
Okay. Well, thanks for giving me and CAPRI the opportunity to share the work we've been doing. We have been doing a lot of work in security, labor market reform, and fiscal policy. And all of them are, of course, interconnected, probably in ways we won't get a chance to go into. Let's start with the issue of violence and at-risk youth. CAPRI has been doing a lot of work in that space for the past few years. And the report that we did this year was really kind of a follow-on from several other reports that we have been doing since 2019, where we've been trying to better understand why we have not been able to reduce our murder rate. It's a very simple, it's not a question of changing cultural attitudes or values and attitudes or cultural norms or social norms. A very simple question of why have we not been able to reduce our murder rate? Jamaica has been an outlier in having one of the highest murder rates in the world for several decades. It's not a new problem. And as long as we've had the problem, we've ostensibly been trying to solve it. And that was really where the inquiry began with the report that we had done in 2019 called Zero Murders, which was looking at August Town's year of zero murders and trying to understand which of the dozens of social interventions that had been done in August Town we could say was the one that, or the one or two that brought about this dramatic reduction, so that we could do it everywhere else and we could just resolve murder altogether. And, you know, what we basically found, to cut straight to the chase, was that we couldn't find that a single intervention had had any effect whatsoever for several reasons, in part because there were so many interventions happening that because they're not monitored and measured in a way that would have allowed us to say one or the other, allowed us or anyone to say one or the other, we couldn't have identified a single intervention in August Town. And we also discovered in looking at the literature and the research that had gone before that this was not an August Town specific problem, that the problem of measuring the outcomes of anti-violent social interventions was widespread. We've never really been able to do it for several reasons, in part because of the way that the outcomes are measured, the way that the interventions are done, the documentation, the monitoring and evaluation. And so we had to do a different kind of inquiry, which was to try and understand, well, what potential do these kinds of interventions have for reducing violence? And that kind of took us down the path to where the report that we came up with in mid-year this year called Groundwork for Peace. And one of the recommendations out of that report was to deprioritize social interventions. This was the headline that got a lot of attention. And the thinking behind that was backed by, a great deal of evidence that went into the report that social interventions that address issues of unemployment, education, parenting, skills training, community unity, sports even, conflict resolution, I'm trying to think of the plethora of goals that many of these interventions have. They're not going to ever be able to reduce violence in the Jamaican context because those are not the things that make us have a high murder rate.
Is it that they wouldn't work because they're not going to because our context is so different, or is it that we don't know that they work because we're not being able to measure them successfully?
Well, that's what we thought at the first, that we didn't know if they work because we couldn't measure them well. And we were working on that premise, but it's actually not quite that. It's that we won't know if they work, and they probably cannot work to reduce murder because those are not the drivers of the murder rate. The drivers of Jamaica's murder rate are not poverty, it's not unemployment, it's not lack of skills, it's not lack of education, it's not inequality, it's not poor parenting, strictly speaking. I mean, we can go more into the weeds on that. The drivers of Jamaica's murder rate are Jamaica's gangs, which operate with impunity, largely based in informal communities. And they operate with impunity because the informality of those communities serve systemic political purposes.
So could we then make the assumption that if we're able to fix the issue of informal communities, then we ought to be able to fix the issue of gangs and gang violence? That's
the proposal. That's the thinking. So the theory of change there is if you look at Jamaica's gangs, I'm going to be very specific about what we're talking about. So you'll have, a very high murder rate in a U.S. city, Baltimore, Chicago, and they introduce a program of drug addiction treatment and employment programs and perhaps violence interruption. And you'll see a fall in the murder rate in that city. And that may be fine because those are the problems that drive the murder rate in that city. We don't have a violence that is fueled by drug addiction, which is a problem across many U.S. cities. If you look at Philadelphia, for example, many of the U.S. cities that have high murder rates, there's a drug addiction and drug trafficking problem. We don't have that problem. Those initiatives, those interventions are not going to work for us. We are not dealing with a situation where people are having issues so much with not being able to resolve arguments peacefully. Yes, we have that, but that's not what's driving up our murder rate. So a violence interruption program is probably not going to do much good here because that's not the driver of the issue. The drivers of the issue are the conditions in which gangs are able to operate, sustain themselves, reproduce themselves. I'm sure you've heard before where police or someone else would say, as you cut one down, 10 more emerge. That's because the environment is conducive to that. It's not a hydra. It's not an animal that has this magical power of reproducing itself. It's because the context and the environment and the circumstances are conducive to gangs operating. And so we have to change the environment. It's not about individual people having, had a traumatic childhood and so they are compelled to act out violence. Yes, children who have suffered trauma are more likely to commit violence as adults. They're not going to pick up a gun and murder 8 people in a community while they're playing dominoes. That is a function of a completely different mechanism, a completely different set of incentives, and that's what the gangs are. It's a very specific way of operating that we have to deal with that very specific thing.
So help us to understand, though, before we get into labor market disengagement, that was the second part of the question. I think I've gotten so much now that I don't want to yet jump into that. Unpack for us, what should we consider to be informal settlements or informal communities, and why is that such an issue, and how does it breed the kind of violence that you're talking about?
Yeah, so informal communities, or we could also say semi-formal communities, are essentially at the base of it places where the people who live there do not have legal tenure to where they live, and they cannot sell or trade the place that they live in or cash in on its value.
So like squatter settlements?
Squatter settlements, also some of the government housing that came up in the 70s is also, so anywhere, if you live somewhere and you don't have a title to it and you can't sell it or you can't rent it, essentially you don't have legal tenure to that place.
Oh.
And you basically have insecure tenure to that place. That means you depend on someone else for the right to live where you live. That is kind of the root of the issue. Having a title to where you live comes with many, many benefits. It gives you access to the formal financial system, it gives you access to capital, but most importantly, it gives you the security of tenure of where you live. You don't have to worry about somebody coming to kick you out, somebody coming to burn you out, somebody coming to evict you because you have your title, right? Mm-hmm. Or if you're paying rent and you have a proper lease agreement, that would also be constituted. But 20% of Jamaicans live, well, that's a low estimate, 20 to 25% of Jamaicans live in places that they do not have a legal right to live there. And that is the root of the problem.
So that's upward of 500,000 people we're talking about.
600,000
yes.
is a rough estimate that corresponds with that. And so when you don't have tenure and you don't have security of where you live, you don't have any say in what's going on around you. Moreover, most of those communities, the state is hardly there. They're not, the state does not govern those communities. The state doesn't have a presence in those communities. They are not collecting taxes in those communities. The people in there might not even be counted on the census in those communities. One of the things that you'll see JSIF does in ZOSO communities or almost any community that it goes into, one of the first things it does is give people TRN. Mm-hmm. Sometimes even get their birth certificate sorted out, right? It's to get people into the formal system. Those communities are largely isolated socially, economically. Many of them, the housing quality is poor, the sanitation is poor, health conditions are not optimal. So there are a lot of issues that come with informality that mitigate against those communities and the people in those communities being able to operate as citizens in the broader society, including them being able to call the police if somebody comes to their door and is trying to invade their place. So they don't have that right.
So the argument is not that persons from informal communities are the primary violence producers. That's not the issue.
That's not the issue.
The issue is that these informal or semi-formal settlements give rise to that particular issue that we're having.
Yes, and I'm glad you said that because I want that to be very clear. The majority of people, I mean, you've heard it said, there's a very small number of people who drive up our murder rate to this astronomical level that it is. It is not the people in informal communities that are bad people. It is the context and the structure and the system of what makes an informal community informal. It is the fact that those communities are outside of the law often, and so it is we can call it a safe haven, perfect breeding ground for criminality, and in the case of Jamaica, in the perfect way for an organism such as a gang to come up, because they're outside of the law. They're not being reached by police. You'll hear police say they can't go into those communities. They go in, there's one way in, and there's one way out. They have, the way that the communities are set up, they're very ad hoc. There isn't a, nice straight street structure where you can drive a car in and actually give policing and security to a community. And other services as well, sanitation services, electricity and water, all the things that constitute what we would think of as a formal community or as a place where people would be seeking to live. Those things are not available in many of those communities.
So my argument, though, is, question, not an argument, but we know that these informal settlements aren't started by gangs. They aren't, and we can argue that they have been started by the government in that, and here's why I'm saying that. So let me justify what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. The government might have embarked on setting up a place here for persons to live, but then they have not followed through to the extent that they have put in all the necessary social programs and the necessary infrastructure, and then they have left it. So persons come, and because over time we are not maintaining the systems that are supposed to be there, then these things happen. Is there another way that these informal settlements might have arisen?
They arise in different ways. What we call more the semi-formal communities, or the AKA garrisons.
Yeah.
those were communities that were established mainly to provide housing for political supporters and to shore up political support. We can include those in the basket of what we're calling informal communities. Most of the people who live in those communities do not have title to where they live. They do not have security. They're there because of political history, and many of them, if they're not actively aligned to a political party, they're de facto aligned to the political party because the community has been established through that political history starting in the 70s. Those are the communities where you'll find very high voter turnout and voting very clearly along a single line. And you can look at that in the data very clearly if you look at the polling divisions, how that works. Then you have communities of people who have found a space of land that is unoccupied. They start to put their things down there, nobody moves them, and the community grows and grows and grows. These are, we don't like to use the term squatter settlements, but these are the kind of squat settlements. These are the settlements that grow up on gully banks or in captured land spaces that have been abandoned. And where the state has failed in that regard is just in allowing them to stay there. In a country where there are strong property rights, people can't just go put themselves down somewhere and stay there and build up a place and get JPS to connect to electricity and put up concrete structures and so on.
But does that mean then that the property rights aren't as strong as they should be, or they're
exactly,
not enforced?
they're not as strong as they should be at all. A third instance, and this is when you really get into kind of the trickier parts of this problem, is those settlements where politicians have moved people onto spaces and as a form of gerrymandering, where they have, and we know that exists across Jamaica, where politicians have moved groups of people into spaces, whether putting them in state housing or just allowing them to occupy a piece of captured land and leaving them alone. And those areas also become areas that are nice, high voter turnout, regular voters, sure to vote for the MP, especially if the MP has put them there. So we have these different kind of formations of informal and semi-formal communities, but the specifics of it aren't what really matter. What matters is the lack of governance in these spaces and the lack of the state in these spaces, the state's absence from these spaces. And in that vacuum is where the organism of the gang can take root, reproduce, flourish, or we might say fester, and have its base of operation. So when you have the zone of special operation, where the idea is clear, hold, and build, and they clear the community, there's a question, well, aren't you just going to disperse the gangs? They may be dispersed, but once you hold that community and you don't allow the gangs to come back in, they don't have a base of operation. I mean, gangs are made up of human beings who need somewhere to go and sleep, bathe, eat, have their clothes washed, etc., etc.
Have their meetings.
If you remove that from their ability to operate, you've taken out a key logistical means by which they're able to do what they do. If they don't have anywhere to store their weapons, if they don't have anywhere to keep their clothes, if they don't have somewhere to go back to actually rest, then you've removed the place for them to regenerate themselves. So the idea is, it is the nature of these communities. It's not the people in the communities. The majority of people in those communities, as in the rest of Jamaica, are regular, normal people who have arguments and who are able to resolve them. There's this idea, one of the other things that we've been trying to say as often as we can, every opportunity, there's this idea of the culture of Jamaica has a culture of balance. And CAPRI also said it too in our report of gangs. We are trying to make it clear that Jamaica doesn't have a problem of a culture of balance. We have a context in which violent gangs easily operate, and that is the issue. We've been, we do a lot of work with the JCF because, of course, they give us a lot of data.
Right, let me hold it. I want you to hold that thought because we're going to our first break. You're watching The Conversation, and I'm speaking with Dr. Diana Thorburn. I'm the Director of Research at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. You're watching The Conversation. I'm Kwame, and we'll be right back. before the break, we started looking at the fact that Jamaica does not have a culture of violence. What we have is a context in which this violence can actually produce or reproduce rather. But all that you have been saying to me is just perpetuating the question of how. The first one is, how could we have missed it? You know, is it that we have been looking at the data all wrong? And if we have, you know, how can we fix this? And who benefits from the status quo, the current status quo? I guess you can start with the last one first.
Yes. Well, no, let me start back with this idea of the culture of violence and why we are quite firm on this idea that Jamaica does not have a culture of violence. If you take out gang violence out of the equation, Jamaica's murder rate is below the world average murder rate. If you take gang violence out of the equation, and not even including what we call interpersonal violence, which has a lot of strong direct relationship to gang violence for many ways, which we can go into if we have time. If you take out the 70% of murders that are related to gangs, are attributed to gangs, Jamaica becomes a normal country. A normal country where, yes, people murder each other because people do that all over the world, but you also have a country where the police are not overwhelmed by trying to solve 5 murders a day, and they can actually police the issues that in other countries the police are so effectively able to do because they're not overwhelmed by this humongous problem of gangs killing people wantonly, killing each other mainly wantonly every single day.
I don't mean to interrupt the thought process, but then is there a case then in what you've been saying for the zones of specialized operations, the ZOZOs? Is there a space for that to work? Because you said clear whole bill. You said that earlier, and now you're saying what you're saying.
They do
Is there
work.
a space for
no,
that?
we know they work. The data is very clear that they work. I mean, whether you like them or not, the fact is that they work. They do clear the space of the gangs, and they do hold the space. And a lot of the part of the ZOSO is the build of giving people IDs and several interventions. The Groundwork for Peace report actually was arguing that on the list of activities in ZOSOs is land tenure regularization, but it hasn't actually been done. So the main recommendation of that report is to prioritize what is already there. So when you say, have we been looking at the data all wrong and have we been missing it? No, we have not. We've known this problem all along. CAPRI's report was not the first to say that informality is correlated strongly with violence. That data and those findings go back to the late 1970s. We have known very clearly for decades that there is an extremely strong correlation between informality and violence. You ask any JCF officer just off the top of their heads, if you hear that a murder has been committed and you don't know where it is, which direction are you going to head? They're going to head to an informal community. Because that's where, when you look at the data, when we actually do look at the data, a disproportionate number of murders and shootings occur in informal communities. So, I mean, maybe not precise here, but something to the effect of 50% of all murders take place on 5% of space, and that 5% is in informal communities, right?
50% of
so
murders.
it's something to that effect. I haven't come with my numbers on that one, but a disproportionate number of murders and shootings. The other important thing to bear in mind is that 98% of murders and shootings in Jamaica take place outside of the context of any other crime, meaning that the majority of people who get shot and killed in Jamaica are shot and killed because somebody went out to shoot and kill them, not to rob them first, or to kidnap them, or to rape them, or all those other crimes which are trending down in Jamaica and have been trending down for over a decade. If you are shot and killed in Jamaica, the 98% chance is that somebody set out to shoot and kill you, right? That tells you something very specific about the nature of our violence. It is deliberate. It is being used as a tool of operations of the gangs. It is not because we have a culture of violence. We have a high murder rate because we have gangs, and we have so many of them, and they are so active that they overwhelm the capacity of the police. We would not want a police force that could combat our gangs because we would then have so many police. as a country, we would not want such a large police force. We need to reduce the conditions that create the gangs, which is the issue of informality.
So getting more getting more persons in the police force will definitely not fix the issue. You're pretty much putting a Band-Aid over it.
Not with our murder rate, we could not ever get enough police to fix that.
But what I'm hearing though is that Jamaica has again been defined as an outlier in the truest sense of the word, because when you count the informal settlements that we have and its contribution or their contributions to gang violence, that puts us on the other end, being one of the most violent places in the world. But if you remove that, then it puts us on the other end where we are one of the least violent.
We're just a normal country
in the world. But then it begs another question: who benefits from this? Because if we have had this data from in the 70s and we are now 50 plus years, roughly half of a century over that now, someone clearly or some group clearly benefits from this because the changes have not been made.
I mean, the large group is the entire political system is what benefits. If you look at where most votes come from, they come from informal and semi-formal communities. Informal and semi-formal communities have the highest voter turnout.
But couldn't that be fixed though, in that you can still have high voter turnout and still not have informal settlement?
Why are they voting? They're voting because there's a relationship of dependence between the people who live in those communities and the political representative and his or her agents. That's a well-established relationship in Jamaica and in several other countries around the world which have very similar situations. It does not suit the political representative, and I'm not singling out anybody, just in any constituency in Jamaica, in almost any constituency in Jamaica, it does not suit them to disrupt the place where they know that they're going to have a polling division that is going to turn out, 90% of the people are going to turn out and vote for them. It doesn't, which is why the problem of removing garrisons is so difficult in Jamaica, because those garrisons have the highest voter turnout and they have the highest murder rate.
So could we also argue then, because we can see from, I remember having a discussion with Dr. Dan Anderson, and his statement pretty much echoed some of the sentiments that you're now echoing. What if we changed, or how can we change it where we can still have high voter turnout? Because in an instant, no, we have extremely low voter turnout. But based on what you're saying, the highest of the voter turnout is actually coming from those places.
We have a low voter turnout as a population,
yes.
But if you look at who
pockets,
is voting,
there's a high
you
one.
will see middle-class people in Jamaica don't vote. Why are they voting? Politicians are not serving their needs. They don't need the politician. They don't need the politician to help them fill out a form to access state benefits. They don't need the politician to give their kid a tablet during COVID to do homeschooling. And if you go into a community, let's say, many communities in Jamaica have everything is lovely and beautiful, and then you have a little pocket that is a informal community. You follow a politician into that community right before elections and you say where he or she goes. Straight to the informal community. The people who live in the rest of the community, whose roads are full of potholes, whose street lights not working, no politician is going to go knocking on their door because he doesn't need their vote and they don't need him. They've given up. They're going to go about their business and live their lives.
So here's the conundrum. So we have a community. The informal community does not have the benefit of an infrastructure. And so it breeds crime, it breeds violence, and persons are just...
It breeds the conditions for gangs.
So it breeds the conditions for the gangs. But then you have the middle-income communities who are there, and they're also, I'm arguing now that they're not also benefiting from the support that they need from the government as well.
No, they're not.
So if the informal settlements aren't benefiting from...
Well, they're benefiting in a short-term way. There's an exchange of patronage, broadly speaking, for votes, essentially. If you think about it this way, if you have an informal community with 1,000 voters in it, and you know that they're going to turn out and you know they're going to vote for you, why would you formalize that community? As a politician or as a political party sending in a political representative there. The job of the politician is to win an election. If you don't win, you're out of work, you don't have a job. Your job is to secure votes where you can so that you can win that seat.
How can we fix that though?
We can fix it with a bipartisan commitment to fixing it, a real one, and immense public pressure on our political leadership, both sides, not specifying one party or the other, it's both of them. They both have these identical situations in the various constituencies where they are, and immense public pressure on them to see it through. There's an argument, I've heard this argument that, okay, you formalize the community or you remove the patronage or you somehow make the people in there independent of their political representative and you lose their vote. Then what? You've disrupted the mechanism. You've disrupted the whole way in which an election, works. There is an argument that the loss of those votes will be made up for by people who will now enter into the political system because they now see that the political system is actually doing something for them. There's that argument. I mean, I suppose we could do a research where we could use proxy variables and do some kind of econometrics to try and measure that. It's an interesting thought experiment. It takes, I think, people's understanding of the problem. When we say, and we continue to say that, we're going to have an anti-poverty program or a skills training program to divert at-risk youth from joining gangs, that is not going to, we know that that's not going to work, in part because we've been doing that for 20 years and it hasn't worked. And even the current programs, if you read the reports, the monitoring and evaluation reports of current programs doing that, you will see that
That's not working.
It's not working. They're not, there's low take-up of these programs, and it's not affecting the operation of the gangs, right? If you continue to pursue this idea that poverty causes crime, or we need to give people jobs, or they need to have skills, or we need to do parenting training, and that's going to have an impact on the murder rate, instead of pursuing much more deeper, systemic, structural changes, then we're gonna be having this conversation in 5 years. We're gonna be having this conversation in 10 years, just as we would have had it 5 years ago and 10 years ago. Because the context in which gangs are operating, the context in which violence is happening, the context in which the murder rate is so high has not changed. Not in a broad way. Maybe in the communities where you have ZOSOs, but what, we have 13 ZOSOs? One of the problems with ZOSOs is not that they're ineffective, is that we need so many ZOSOs
At once.
that we would never be able to have so many at once. So we wouldn't want a country that had ZOSOs like that. We would feel like we're living in a police state or some kind of military state.
So we don't want to overwhelm this segment with that part of it now. But in the opening question, we started looking at the labor market disengagement. And one of the things that your study brought out was roughly for over 400,000 persons they're not in the market. They're not in the labor market, and that would add to productivity. And I want you to tie that back now to what we've been looking at all along.
Okay, yes, there is an interesting and surprising relationship between informality and the labor market. So, Jamaica has the lowest unemployment rate in its history, one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world, and we have more people are participating in the labor market than ever before. More people are looking for jobs than ever before. More people are employed than ever before, and we still don't have economic growth. That is really the nut of the problem. That is again, Jamaica is an outlier in that regard. In almost every other country in the world, if employment increases,
Productivity
and national income increases, prosperity increases. We don't have that in Jamaica, and part of the problem for that is that we have an extraordinarily low level of productivity in Jamaica. And that's a discussion for us to have. But one of the other things that has come up, and you'll hear this all the time, is employers looking for employees. Sometimes they don't even need them to have subjects. Like, we'll train them. We just need people to work. That's the kind of the flip side of having such a low unemployment rate. There is a tight labor market, meaning that employers are looking for people to work for them. Employees are looking for workers. And so if you have that context and you want to say, well, we have this low unemployment rate, but we also have 400 plus thousand people who are outside the labor force. These are working age people, so not teenagers, not retirees, who we think could be working and should be working, but they're not looking for a job. And some of them say they're not interested in working. So what we wanted to know was, how do we get more of those people outside the labor force into the labor force? So that was the study, Outside In. And I would say we found two main things. About half of those 400,000 people are outside of the labor market for reasons such as they have ill health, disability, many of them are in school, some of them are retired, working age people have retired a bit earlier than usual perhaps. A large chunk of them are not in the labor market because they have unpaid care responsibilities for children or elderly. And then about 200,000, about half of them, 211,000 of that 400,000, mainly young men, are not in the labor force, not in the labor market, not working, not looking for work because they do not want to work.
What does that mean, though? What are some of the reasons behind them not wanting to work, though, you think?
You might think, okay, well, we want to know why they don't want to work. But actually, that's not the question. That is actually not the question. If you look more broadly at Jamaica, in the region and in the world, we have a labor force participation rate that is growing, whereas in almost every other country in the world, it is shrinking. And our labor force participation rate is also higher than the regional and the world average.
Another outlier.
So again, we're an outlier, which suggests that if every country in the world, which almost every country in the world, is trying to improve its labor force participation rate, that's a universal problem that governments are trying to solve. So we have examples of hundreds of interventions and programs to try and improve labor force participation rates. And we know that very few of them actually can yield measurable results. And we have a labor force participation rate that is higher than average. Then maybe the question isn't to try and figure out why they don't want to work, but to look at other ways of improving productivity of the workers that are already in the labor force, rather than trying to get more people in, because it just might not be a possible thing to do.
Could wages then be an issue? Because we know that it has been said that we have a low-skilled, low-tech, low-wage population. Could that be one of the issues why, one,
wages
you get what you pay for?
Wages are only going to be as high as our productivity is. Wages are going to go up when productivity goes up. So there's a circle, or a cycle rather, of you have low productivity, you have low skills, low wages, workers who are not very productive, and it kind of goes in the cycle. So the question then is, well, what can we do to break that cycle? Where can we intervene in that cycle? There's things that the government can do apart from skills training, or trying to motivate people, or even raise the retirement age, which have to do with kind of the more infrastructure parts of productivity, better roads, better transportation, better communication systems, the things that generally increase productivity anywhere in the world. But then there's other things that you might not have thought of, and this is where we come back to the issue of informality. One of the surprising findings of land titling, and this has been observed especially in kind of the poster child for land titling, which is Peru, is that the more people who receive titles is the more people participate in the formal labor market. So in the Peruvian situation, where they issued hundreds of thousands of titles in Lima, in urban areas, it was not an intention of the program to do this. An unexpected outcome was that for every 4 titles, one person joined the formal labor force.
It's a 25% return.
And that wasn't even the objective,
because
there's huge other benefits that come with land titling. There's welfare benefits, health benefits. People invest more in their children's education. They send their children out to work less. They invest in their property. they upgrade their property, they have access to the formal financial system, they become part of the formal finance. So you don't need to have the objective of labor market participation to pursue land titling. There's many reasons to do it, but it is one of the unexpected outcomes of land titling, and it might be one of the more unusual ways perhaps in which we can start to think about, okay, if we're going to be innovative, if we're going to break this cycle, is this one of the things that we might do? That's the idea.
All right, so I think we're at the end of this segment again. There are so many more questions in my head now, but what I've gotten from the discussion that we've been having so far is that there seemed to be, in my mind, a correlation between the labor market disengagement and the idea of violence as well. Not that they're directly connected, but in trying to fix one, then we might invariably end up fixing the other.
We might, yeah. That's the idea. That's what the data from the rest of the world has shown us. That's what the theoretical relationship is. I wouldn't say that we should do formalization just to deal with issues of the labor market.
No.
But it would have a beneficial effect. We do know that formalization would reduce violence because it would eliminate the conditions in which gangs can operate. We do know that giving people title to their land would increase prosperity, both in the short and medium and long term. So there's a lot of benefits to formalization, some direct, some indirect. Violence and labor market participation are two of them.
All right, so I want to thank you very much for having allowed us to have this very robust discussion. And on the other side of the break, we'll see what else we can get to uncover. Just want to remind you that you're watching The Conversation. I'm Kwame Thomas, and I'm sat here with Dr. Diana Thorburn of CAPRI. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Conversation. We have been having a very robust discussion with the Director of Research at Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI, Dr. Diana Thorburn. So just before the break, we started looking at how some of these interventions, if we tried to put in some of these interventions, we might solve more problems. Because what we have been doing so far, we've been looking at, whether it's deliberately or otherwise, we've been looking at the wrong set of variables. So we have been fixing a problem that we didn't have.
Well, I think that there's important clarification to be made. There's social interventions. Jamaica needs a lot of social interventions. We need interventions in the mental health system. Only 8% of children's mental health needs are being met in Jamaica. There's a desperate intervention there. We need interventions with infants, poor infants and their nutrition and their development and their cognitive development. There's a whole range of areas in the social space that need interventions. The question is, do we need to do social interventions to reduce our murder rate? That is where we have to be careful to separate what we're talking about.
So do we?
Well, if we want to solve the drivers of our murder rate, then skills training, employment, parenting, and so on are not going to. They will do other things. They may do other things. That's a whole other conversation.
But it won't solve the crime problem.
They're not going to solve the issue of our high murder rate because poverty, poor parenting, low skills, unemployment are not what drives our murder rate. And I think that's a distinction that needs to be repeated and made, and not to say, oh, social interventions don't work. Whether they work or not is a completely different conversation. I mean, if you're in the mental health space and you're trying to understand, well, what works to improve people's mental health? Urging people to avoid stress does not help to reduce people's mental health problems. So putting more resources by paying people in the mental health, that would help. Okay, so the question of what works as a social intervention is a separate question from what social interventions work to reduce the murder rate. We're pretty certain that none of them do, because our murder problem is not related to the social issues that many or most interventions seek to interrupt.
And for the record, we have to let them know that you're talking from an evidence-based
Oh,
perspective.
absolutely.
So it's not a case whereby you're just picking things out of the air.
Yeah, and also this is also not new evidence.
Well, you have stated over 50 years worth of
Yeah, so
data.
when we did the report on Augusttown, this is back in 2019, and at the time, this was a new area for CAPRI that we were working. We hadn't done anything in the security sector before. And so we came to the topic kind of very much with a beginner's mindset, without any preconceived notions and, not having any real exposure to the conventional wisdom. So, we're doing this research on, okay, well, how do we measure the impact of social interventions on violence? And we're looking at all this literature, including for Jamaica, but Latin America and the Caribbean largely, but including specific to Jamaica, saying that there's no way of measuring these interventions. The way they're implemented does not allow us to discern if there's an impact of these interventions on violence. And in any case, if these interventions are not targeting the drivers of violence, then they can't, as effective as these interventions might be, if you have a parenting program that is going to improve parenting skills, that's wonderful. But if that intervention is not going to, if improving parenting is not going to reduce the murder rate, then you don't want to be doing that intervention to reduce murder. You want to do it to improve parenting, which is a very worthy objective.
And entirely different objective.
It's an important objective. There is many, many outcomes that are related to good or bad parenting. We know that also the data tells us that. There is a parenting intervention called Reach Up, which is very simple. It teaches mothers how to play with their babies. There is a very powerful thing that happens between a mother and child when a mother looks at her baby and talks to her baby and plays with her baby. It has fundamental impact on a child's outcomes. So they've done the study. It's a famous study done right here in Jamaica, designed here in Jamaica, where they took 4 groups. They had a group that received of poor mothers of what they call stunted children. It's not a term that's used very much, but basically children who are showing some kinds of delays.
Yeah.
They had 4 groups of mothers and babies. One group got nutrition supplementation and mother training. Mother was taught how to play with her baby, talk to her baby, look her baby in the eye. Another group was taught only teach mother how to play with baby. Another group only got nutrition supplements, and one group got nothing at all. The group that got the nutrition and the parenting training, and the group that got the parenting training only, the children of those mothers had higher education levels, fewer health problems, including fewer mental health problems. They were better socially adjusted. They had better jobs. They had higher incomes. They had fewer interactions with the law. Every possible outcome that you would want to try and intervene for was improved by teaching a mother to play with her baby. So when we say social interventions don't work, we are saying that they don't work to reduce violence, because the only variable that did not change on any of the groups, propensity to join a gang.
So what we're saying that the propensity to join a gang has more to do with the environment in which you exist, as opposed to the interventions.
And that study alone, if you don't believe anything else, that study is proof of that argument.
Is there a study that we could have, or we have, with fathers involved in that, though, to see what the
No, but I'm
changes would have
pretty sure that you would have a similar result. I mean, kind of, we're going off topic a bit here, but
just a little.
Most of the literature on children's outcomes, including for Jamaica, is not whether they grow up with mommy and daddy or with a mother or a father. It is that they have a stable attachment to a single person. The worst outcomes for children are for the children who are shifted. This thing in, not just Jamaica and the Caribbean, where children are moved from one place to another, and think it's something to the effect of 15% of children in Jamaica are not living with a biological relative. Those are the children that are going to have the worst outcomes if they don't have an attachment to a single person. So it's the child that is not able to form an attachment who has the worst outcomes. Not whether mommy and daddy are in the home or what have you. It's the having the attachment with an adult.
And the implications of this is manifested in, one, the propensity to join the gang is already there. So that actually might aid.
Well, the propensity to join the gang is determined by if you have a gang in your community.
Yeah.
And if you have nobody parenting you and there's a gang in the community, then that's
highly likely.
That's highly likely. I mean, if we're going to talk about at-risk youth, those are probably the most at-risk youth. But once a gang is in the community, no skills program is going to make any material dent. You may pick up one or two, and you'll hear those success stories all the time. Such and such a program saved me from joining the gang, and I finished my degree, and now I have a job, and so on. But one person is not going to make a macro impact on the murder rate.
So we have heard all of those things. We have heard, we have seen where your reports have emphasized structural changes such as improving community infrastructure and land tenure. The land tenure regularization, that's the thing that actually got to me. But how can these interventions simultaneously tackle violence reduction as well as labor market participation? That's where we were heading before we segued, so I just want to bring it back right there.
Wow, there's a lot going on there. I think there's a lot of indirect relationships between all of these things. We talked earlier about the impact of giving titles on labor market participation. So there's that connection there. The more formal a community is the more likely that the people in the community are going to also be a part of the formal labor market, the formal financial system, the more they're going to be participating in the formal society and economy, broadly speaking. The more formal a community is, the less likely that there are going to be gangs there. There's, greater likelihood that violence will be lower or will reduce. There are fewer gangs for unattached youth or an at-risk youth or a not well-parented youth to join that gang. So I think there's different connections. I mean, is there one intervention that is going to tackle all of these things? Probably not. But if there was one, it would be, if there was one grand intervention that we're going to say is a silver bullet, the one thing that could solve many of these problems, it probably would be formalization of the community, land titling. I mean, we know for labor market, for example, I said that countries all over the world are trying to improve their labor force participation rates, and many, many interventions have been tried, and very few of them work. And we know two that work. One is increasing the retirement age, so bringing people out of retirement, which has a small little effect, a minor effect.
Because there are only a few persons who are actually
There's not that many
leaving.
people to do that with. The one that has the most measurable effect, and again, it's a small group, but it has enough of an impact that it could actually move the needle, is providing care support to people with unpaid care responsibilities. These are mostly women. In Jamaica and everywhere around the world, 98% of them are women. And it would mean providing supported, subsidized daycare of some sort for people who have to look after children, who have to look after elderly, that would allow them to go and look for work and to take up jobs.
So what we have seen in Jamaica, there's probably one company that jumps at the top of my head. I won't mention the name, but they have something like a daycare that's attached to the organization. So when the parent comes to work, he or she can actually take the child to work knowing that that child is close by, and you can just go down and check on them.
The data is very clear. The companies that support their workers' care needs have higher profits. That's not even a question. And that, again, is not just a Jamaican thing. We actually did a study on that. We don't have the data for Jamaica, but the IFC did a study of 10 companies and measured their revenues, profit, net profit, before they implemented worker support and after. And for all 10 companies, their profits increased when they gave support to their workers. So the outlay of the cost was more than covered by the increase in profits of the business.
No, So my question still is, because
Why don't people do it?
how have we missed this and why don't we do it?
I think capacity is an issue. I mean, just the capacity to take up these new ideas and to, corral the resources to bring about these changes. That capacity is lacking. I mean, there are a lot of companies in Jamaica that are doing it, the ones that are well known and some that are less well known. They have realized that, okay, this actually benefits me to give support to my worker, but it's also a responsibility of the state to do this as well.
So when we say capacity, though, are we talking about we don't have enough financial resources, we don't have enough labor resources, we don't have the right mindset, we don't have enough information? How do we define that capacity?
For me, when I'm talking about the lack of capacity to do these things, I mean people in an organization, any organization, state, private sector, who have the ability to take on new tasks and execute them. I mean, that's a very nebulous way of putting it, but I don't think that we have, and I think this is related to our issues of low productivity as well, is that we don't have a workforce especially in the public sector, that is able to just get a volume of things done. And we have a lot that needs to be done. And to me, that's the issue. And the solution is not to hire more unproductive people. The solution is to improve people's productivity. And then the question comes, well, how do you improve people's productivity? Better working conditions, better wages. But how are you going to improve people's wages if they're not productive in the first place to generate the income to do that? So again, we get back to the question of the circle and how do we find the interventions in the circle, in that cycle?
Would it make sense for an intervention from the part of the government in that so we saw where the remuneration exercise that was done, that was well needed, but it sounds to me that it's not enough. And I doubt it would have been considered as the first.
I mean, we won't know the impact of that for another few years. To my mind, and based on the data from everywhere else, if there was one thing that could have been done, that would have been it. So we're all anticipating what the outcome of that will be, and I really, really hope somebody has been doing the baseline data collection so that we have something to measure against, so that we can actually say that it has had an impact and what the impact has been. I think there are other things that can be done. If we're going to talk about the impact on the labor market and labor market participation and balance, another relationship that is often not considered is that 85% of our tertiary graduates leave Jamaica. That is a huge problem in terms of our productivity and this availability of skills. 85%. 85% of tertiary trained people leave Jamaica, many of them who have actually been educated at taxpayers' expense, right? That's another issue that we can go into if we have the time. But if you think about it, how do we keep so many of our skilled people from leaving? Well, one of the reasons people leave is because they can get better job opportunities. Another reason a lot of people leave is because Jamaica is too violent. They don't want to bring up their children. They don't want to have children and live in a country where they have to be looking over their shoulder all the time. But if you consider that one of the reasons why there are fewer job opportunities here is because investment is curtailed by the level of violence. There's many businesses that simply cannot operate in such a violent context. There's many businesses that cannot grow because their security costs are so high. There's many businesses that don't even exist because the people who might have thought to do them will take one look and be like, there's no way I'm going to Jamaica where the murder rate is high and where I have to be spending 20% of outlay on security costs. So there is a relationship between violence and labor market productivity and the whole issue of productivity and our national growth, prosperity, and so on, in that the high level of violence that we experience, our high murder rate, deters investment, deters businesses from being started and from growing, and so reduces what job opportunities are. So there is a very strong argument to be made that if we could reduce the murder rate, we would retain more of our tertiary graduates because there would be more opportunities here. It would be a safer and nicer place to live. You might even get people coming back here.
So the argument then is that gang activity is a significant barrier to labor and social engagement. That's pretty much what we've been saying now.
That is pretty much what I'm saying, I suppose. Yeah, it is. If you know, there's this kind of utopia where if we remove the gangs, Jamaica would be a very, very, very different place.
Tell me about policies now. How can the policies that we have to address these issues, such as perhaps the subsidized, you spoke about the subsidized caregiving support, but what kind of targeted anti-gang initiatives we can have to transform those communities though?
Well, I mean, what we've said in the report and what the evidence has shown is that you need a combination of short-term security measures and the more medium and longer term measures and policy measures of formalization and infrastructure development and community development for informal communities. The security measures are important because the violence producers, as we call them, have to be removed from the community. And we've seen that that's not just a theoretical idea, that's something that we've seen. If you look at the record of the ZOSOs, they have had reductions in violent crime. In some of them, they've had complete elimination of violent crime because the gangs have been displaced. That is not, you know, as we said earlier, we don't have the resources to implement the number of ZOSOs. And also, we don't want to have communities being occupied by military and police on the long term. First of all, it's not desirable for a democratic country to have people.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to have these people. And also, the data shows that their effectiveness diminishes over time. That's just a well-established fact. So the longer they're in the communities, the less effective they're going to be. So it's not even a sustainable solution. It is what has to be done in the short term to curtail the violence, to reduce the production of violence. That is a security operation. But those security operations have to be carefully planned and executed with the other policy interventions, formalization, community infrastructure, building these communities so that they're part of the wider society, the wider economy, that they're participating, that they're going out to vote as citizens, not as recipients of patronage, that they are paying taxes, land taxes and other taxes, that their children are going to good schools that are able to be better supported because those communities are thriving in a way that they would not have when they were informal and infested with gangs.
So we're talking about trying to establish a balance between short-term safety concerns and long-term investment. That's
and
what we're thinking
medium
about.
And long term. Medium and long term.
So then the question now comes up, what roles do the communities themselves play in implementing and sustaining these kind of structural reforms that we're looking at, and how can they become empowered to actually participate fully in them?
Yeah, this is a sensitive question because, you know, we spoke earlier that when we talk about informal communities kind of being the source of the violence problem, we want to be careful not to stigmatize the people who live in these communities. Yeah. The majority of people who live in informal communities are there because they don't have a choice. If you gave people in those communities a choice, chances are they would not be there.
Yeah.
There are semi-formal communities, many of the communities in downtown where they have actually done land titling pilots, and the people who receive the titles they're not leaving those places. They know that they're in a great location. They're just happy to have the title because they have security of tenure. But outside of, situations like that, most people in informal communities are there because they don't have a choice and because they can't leave. How do we then, let's say we're going to put all the resources that are needed to formalize an informal community. It's not on a gully bank, so the people don't have to be moved. It's not in an unsafe space, so the people can stay there. We're going to give them a title, and hopefully all the benefits of that will follow. We're going to take the gangs out. They're not going to be able to come back because everybody there will have title to their land, and they'll be able to call the police to come and protect them. We're going to put roads in so that there is a proper thoroughfare through these communities for citizens and security forces alike, for the state to go in. People are going to pay their taxes, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what is it that needs to be done to sustain these things on the community's part? Well, clearly the community is going to have to be brought into the process. They're going to have to be a part of the process. They're going to have to be, given the information. This is what's going to happen. This is what we're doing. This is what to expect. There may be a need for financial literacy training. There may be a need for, this is maybe where some of those social interventions actually are going to be coming in, because you've now given people an actual foundation on which to build their lives. So things like parenting training, skills training, employment training, or employment opportunities, entrepreneur training, and so on. The difference between giving those interventions and programs to people who are in a secure place, who don't have to be looking over their shoulder, who don't have to be worrying about the Don coming and kicking them out because they haven't paid some tribute of some sort or not informed on them or what have you. There's a very big difference between a set of social programs going to a community that is secure where they are, as opposed to a community where they don't even know if they're going to be able to be in that spot tomorrow, depending on the whim and fancy of somebody who is completely lawless.
I mean, there's a lot of things for us to consider. No, because many of us might not have looked at the connections that you have just made between informal settlements, tenure regularization, violence, caregiving. So, and we have all thought that the social programs were not enough. But there was no real context to us saying why they were not enough. But just to understand now that we have been looking at it all wrong, to the extent that we are trying to solve problems that we can't yet solve because the foundations upon which we should solve those problems have not yet been built. Dr. Thorburn, thank you very much for sitting and having this conversation. I could go on because there's a lot more questions that are generating in my head. And I'd love to have this opportunity to speak with you again, to engage you on some of these issues that we are facing. But until then, let me just say thanks for sitting down. Thanks for having the conversation. And for you there, you're watching us in TV land, we want to just say a big thank you on behalf of the entire Scene TV production team. You have just watched the conversation. This was supposed to be the year in review. But we have looked at something that will definitely add some value as we reflect on 2024 with the intention of moving into 2025. Thank you very much for sitting and having this conversation. Thank you for making Scene your place to see all these things. I'm Kwame Thomas, wishing you a safe and prosperous 2025. Have yourselves a good night.